Trends in renewables. It's a pleasure having Gerald Peruggio today. Gerald is a head of Hystad Australia and Global Renewables. Good morning, Gerald.
Good morning, Carvalho, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I really appreciate the opportunity and the great work that you're doing with these podcasts in Brazil.
Thank you, Gerald. It was a pleasure for me. Gerald, please, considering the volumes of renewables under development in the world nowadays, compared to the scale of fossil energies that's very well established in the world, of course, do you understand that the world is moving at a good speed in the energy transition?
Well, look, I don't know if you're a Star Wars fan or a Star Trek fan, Carvalho, but it's going at hyperspeed. It's going much quicker than possibly the sector itself can even maintain at the moment. So you often see, you only need to pick up a newspaper and you see the level of investment and discussion on renewables and the transition to see the energy and the investment that's going into this sector. So it's moving very, very quickly. But with this, you have ups and downs. And that's always been the case with renewables. Let's take solar, for example. It's often referred to as the solar coaster because some years it's boom and then the next year it's bust and it's boom and it's bust. And that's just a reflective of the speed of which this transition is happening. I would say that if you look at where we are today in this moment, and if you'd have asked me 6 months ago, it would have been a completely different story. For right now, Europe, on terms of transition, has never been hotter, probably the hottest place in the world. And that's as a result of the crisis in Ukraine and Russia, really accelerating a transition that was already hot. In China, again, we expected maybe some softening in development of renewables, but this is going to be record years for China when it comes to energization of renewables. They've really stepped on, found a new gear for renewable investment in China. And in the US 6 months ago, it was an incredibly hot market. But in the solar side of things, these investigations into imports of panels and tariffs has really put the brakes and questioned the confidence of investment there. So again, it's just ups and downs. In 2 or 3 months, it could be completely different again. But the speed is
fast enough to make the transformation in the world and the investments that companies are doing in this sector of renewables, Gerald.
Yeah, in terms of the investment levels, you're obviously seeing significant investment both on the solar and the wind side. But I think the one area that's most interesting to us at the moment is the energy storage side of things as well. And we're seeing investments there picking up globally as this transition accelerates.
Good. The fluctuation, because a renewable is not stable in terms of production. Solar, wind depends on weather and everything. So what do you mean in terms of the future of energy security, in terms of this problem of renewables?
Yeah, there's a few different thoughts of that. And I think you can look, and so I'm based in Australia, and that's a great example of where to see, because it's an isolated market. It doesn't rely on any connections to any other grids. Really, it's an isolated power market here, and you can see that it struggles with that when it comes to the actual transition of that, because it needs to have that firming, that security of supply, and we're backed up by coal, which is very inflexible. But you're blessed in Brazil. You're backed up by hydro power mainly, and
7% of the electricity.
Yeah, and this you can be very flexible. So the ability to go 100% renewables in Brazil is a lot easier because you can actually or you can increase and decrease the level of power from the hydro better. It's more flexible than the coal power generation, and equally gas is obviously very flexible as well. So the key element is that ability to ramp up and ramp down, and when you talk about these duck curves, when in the daytime solar comes in and then effectively there's a significant amount of solar in the daytime, and then nighttime that obviously disappears. It's the ability to manage that, and the ability to manage weather events when maybe there isn't much sun in a particular area.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you've got Australia and Brazil, both two very big countries. So, if you had an incredibly established grid, you can manage that just by having capacity throughout, and maybe you can alleviate the issues with weather there. But storage is the big challenge, and storage and it's the cost of storage that we're seeing. It's really exciting times. Actually, we've just entered what I'd describe as the era of utility storage, the era of batteries.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Cavagna, as soon as we enter this era of batteries, it's exciting time for batteries. The only thing anyone could talk about is hydrogen, and that's a different subject.
That's a good point, because fossil energies are, let's say, are not so only gasoline and diesel. So there is an industrial demand, very strong industrial demand, and petrochemical applications. So how can renewables can replace the fossil energies for those other applications?
It's a really good it's a good question. So obviously, when it looks at power generation, there's a lot to be done still. The majority of the world's power is still from fossil fuels, coal and gas. So there's a lot of opportunity for renewables to displace that. And pretty much all of the requirements for emissions and to get this 1.6 degree scenario can be achieved by just decarbonizing the rest of the power sector. But there's a lot more that can be done throughout other sectors as well. So there's areas of hard to abate areas where you can't replicate renewables, can't kind of substitute high emitting sectors, and that's where hydrogen can come in. And hydrogen's also coming in areas where they're just not capable of producing the renewables. Say, for example, Japan, it doesn't have the land mass to have the huge utility scale renewables that we've seen elsewhere in the world. So it's looking to import that from areas like Australia. So it's really exciting areas, and hydrogen is you only need to look at Europe. When Europe is trying to find alternatives to Russian gas, they're looking to renewables, but they've also made a big play on green hydrogen as well.
You mentioned green hydrogen. Which source we can find to make the green hydrogen? I mean, is a industrial viable? I mean, let's see, the price are good for green hydrogen?
Well, it wasn't. I mean, green hydrogen, the reality was it's a decade away at certain scales. In some situations, in small scales, when you've got really expensive alternatives in some part of the world, say, for example, here in Australia, remote mining that imports diesel and the ability to produce hydrogen locally and replace that, absolutely competitive. And there's pockets and opportunities in the world where green hydrogen makes absolute sense, not just environmentally, but economically also.
Yeah.
But in terms of that large scale, where we're talking about tens of gigawatt projects, these are still many years away, possibly even a decade away. Bearing in mind the average size of a green hydrogen electrolyzer is about 3 or 4 megawatts. We think that's going to increase by 20 times over the next couple of years by 2025. But it's still a long way from producing these 10, 15, 20 gigawatt projects that companies are proposing. And with more frequency every month, there seems to be a new project somewhere in the world. Mm-hmm. And certainly Australia and the Middle East are two areas that are really standing out as being the hotspots for these gigascale green hydrogen projects. But the US, not to be undone, is making a late charge for that as well.
And the storage for hydrogen.
Well, there's a few schools of thought there. I think the interesting thing about green hydrogen is that it's being picked up by the oil and gas companies. And now the oil and gas companies for a few years struggled to see how they could make an impact in renewables. And they initially latched onto offshore wind, thinking, well, we've got this offshore oil and gas capability. We can apply that to offshore wind. We can make a difference. So initially, oil and gas companies looked at offshore wind. Now they're really focused on hydrogen as well, green and blue hydrogen. And essentially because it's renewables, but it's not in the form of electrons. It's being transported and produced in the form of molecules. It's very similar to where their core competencies are on the gas side. Highly experienced at these massive LNG projects globally, production, the shipping, and then the transportation through pipelines as well. So and of course the storage. So the oil and gas companies very much see green hydrogen as part of their strategy for renewables going forward.
Do you believe that the oil companies are modifying their portfolios to adapt to the renewables, and that can they survive for the next step? I mean, not new players coming and taking place of them for renewables.
This is can the oil and gas companies survive the transition?
Yeah.
Well, that's a very controversial question. I think if you ask 100 people, you probably get different answers. But well, I'm absolutely convinced that they will, because they have a lot to offer the renewable sector. They have a lot of skills in things like offshore development, which is good for wind, but also more solar as well. They have skills for these massive projects to transport molecules like we talked about, so they can bring a lot to the green hydrogen sector. And they also have a lot of experience and skills working globally. Okay? And these are three great skill sets, and not just globally, but in some incredibly harsh environments as well. So they've got a lot of experience they can bring to that. So I think this will help them through the transition. You've seen a lot of announcements every month by oil and gas companies of new projects, whether it's offshore wind in Brazil or green hydrogen here in Australia. You see more and more announcements, but the investment levels for these companies is still very shy of where they are in their legacy. Say about 5 or 6 times the amount of investment in oil and gas projects than what is currently going into renewables. But even that, I think, is incredible progress. To think that there's over $1 to $2 billion a year from these companies going into renewables, it's still a great development for where they were a few years ago. And I think, Carvana, we can expect a lot more from these companies over the next 2 years. And the speed at which they're transitioning is incredible. And again, they can help the overall global energy transition a lot.
I'm not sure you can mention companies or names, but which ones are the best in these renewables initiatives that are moving forward in this direction?
Well, they've all had some great announcements and developments in their own respect, but I will pick out a couple that I think deserve mentioning. First is Total Energies. Apart from rebranding themselves to Total Energies and really making this push to be a powerhouse, the level of investments and the level of M&A activity from Total has been second to none. And I think in the industry, it is regarded as actually not just making the most, but the smartest and some of the best moves in the industry. So you've seen a huge transformation in their portfolio. And in terms of that example, they've actually got quite a significant amount of investment each year. So I think we mentioned them. The second one I'd mention would be Equinor, that has just really been very successful in establishing himself, not just as an offshore player, but as a really globally recognized and valued offshore wind player as well. So 2 companies that have done incredibly well from the energy transition so far.
Good, Jero. And companies that are not oil companies that are doing a very strong job at big companies, I mean, that are players in the renewables. Can you mention someone?
Yeah, well, Iberdrola is probably up there as the top. You've got RWE, you've got a number of players that are actually the equivalent of the oil and gas super majors. And these are players that have actually built global portfolios. But there's not many of them. We have the majority of renewables developers are local. Certainly in each market, you see local developers. But in those local developers, you'll see always a handful of companies that are these global renewable super majors. And they've, whereas I think the oil and gas companies typically have set themselves targets of developing 50 gigawatts of renewables by 2030. The renewable super majors are setting targets over double this by 2030.
Wow.
That's the level of investment that you're seeing in comparison to some of those oil and gas companies.
You mentioned something very interesting, in my opinion. Renewables are more local than global because you do not have logistics enough for renewables. And do you agree? Do you accept accept the local content concept? I mean, market protection quote. And if you agree with the local content, what do you mean in terms of renewables local content? Is it possible? What are the rules for this approach?
Yeah, look, it's a very good point. But I think the renewables I mentioned as a local developers primarily because the power markets are localized. So the pricing and the actual power markets are very much a local thing. And it's not like a global commodity like you have at the moment with oil and gas, where global players are producing essentially the same commodity. Right? So it's very much local because of that. But you raise a good point about local content. Now, is this going to hinder or help the industry? Now, it's absolutely essential to develop local supply chains for a couple of reasons. But the first one we mentioned is because you need to have this security of supply. And we've seen, if anything, what we've learned from the situation in Europe at the moment is that you can't rely on one or two supply chains there. You have to have this diversity of supply, and you have to actually have security in supply. And when you look at the transition, and when you look at the energy transition, the amount of investment in solar, in wind, you actually really want to secure those supply chains, and they'll be critical to delivering those. And I think that the supply chains.
Sorry, trying to not have shortages and disruptions of production. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Because we look right now, the solar panels essentially, majority of them are coming from China or Chinese companies. But if there's a disruption in that supply chain, or indeed if China's demand exceeds a certain level, then that could have strains on the global supply networks. So it's a security of supply, but then there's also the issue of investment and jobs and development in each country. So if the supply chains to some extent aren't localized, then all of that investment goes overseas. And I don't think any government will sit back and let this happen. When you're looking at the levels of investment by the end of the decade, it's probably been okay so far, but certainly when you look at the US, the levels of investment where they're going to in solar and wind, they would want to see very well established local supply chains there. You're seeing this in India as well, and I expect you'll see this everywhere in the world.
When you mention local content, you mean establishing minimum levels of purchase in the country, or strong strategies to develop the supply chain locally?
You essentially both. Yeah, you need to have certain amount of local content will ensure you have those supply chains developed in each country.
Okay. The last point, please, Gerald. We are living in instability of energy supply worldwide speaking. So the natural gas from Russia interrupted by Nord Stream 2 that's not licensed. LNG coming from the US to Europe in a crude of cargo ships, 70 cargo ships per month or per. So oil with a high price and OPEC plus is not adapting the total production to fit the consumption, the world consumption. What do you see in this instability in the world nowadays?
Well, I mean, it is as we're saying at the very start of this podcast, the energy transition or renewable investment has found another gear, certainly been boosted in recent months. But you quite rightly say that almost every energy level has seen some sort of boost, but you've seen prices again rise to record levels when it only seems months ago we were talking about the lowest prices in these sectors. So they've suddenly all gone incredibly expensive. But I think this is actually important to manage all the inflation issues. One of the things that's challenging renewables right now, and it actually could hinder, one of the biggest challenges, and it's probably one of the biggest challenges it faces for a long time, is the level of hyperinflation and the cost of all of these developments. It's fine to say we want a transition and we want to hit this target, but if the cost of developing solar and wind and storage is so high that it's not economic, of course, none of this investment will happen. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. You need to see that the offtake agreements go up. You need to see power prices or power purchase agreements for renewables go higher than they have been, just to overcome this inflation issue at the moment. And I think that's just the sign of the times. It's expensive for us to do anything at the moment. When I next come and see you in Brazil and we have that coffee, it'll probably be a lot more expensive than it would have been if we had it today.
Yeah, that's right. High price, oil price and natural gas price are good or bad for renewables development?
I think, again, that's probably not a question for me. I just look purely on the renewables, and I think if I had to answer it, I'd say it's very good. But when you look at if things are really overpriced, it tends to give the opportunity for competing technologies to come in. But I'd have to say, from the renewable side, we're talking about the highest cost renewables globally. We're talking about peak oil for renewables at the moment. So it's not just oil and gas prices that are high. It's peak renewable costs as well.
Okay, good.
Which is bad for renewables.
Yep, that's
and possibly
in this sense.
And you could say that's good for oil and gas and coal as well.
That's right. Okay, it was a pleasure having Gerald Ferruggio today with us from Highstead, Australia. Thank you so much for this conversation today.
It's a pleasure, and we look forward to see you very soon.